Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome to our first episode in our Chapter 23, Lecture 23 series. And our topic for this video is the respiratory system. So we're going to do just a real brief introduction to the structures of the respiratory system. This should complement what you're already doing in your lab study. So you are going, of course, more detailed there. First, let's talk about some of the jobs of the respiratory system. So, of course, the respiratory system we know is responsible for bringing air into the body. It is providing that surface for gas exchange so that the air can make its way into the blood, meaning oxygen gas is, of course, moving from the air into the blood, and then carbon dioxide gas is moving from the blood out to the air so that the respiratory system can help remove that CO2 gas. In addition to allowing surface for gas exchange between the air and the blood, we also need to actually get that air in and out of the lungs. We also will see that the respiratory system will protect those respiratory surfaces from dehydration and temperature changes, as well as possible pathogen invasion. The respiratory system is involved in the production of sound, so we'll just mention that real briefly. You'll look at those structures in a lot of detail as part of your lab work. And then also, we've already seen that the nasal cavity is important in olfaction, so that's a piece of information that we've already studied. Okay, so looking at the path of air into the body, of course, the nose is the beginning of that path. You all have had colds before and know how unpleasant it is to be a mouth breather. Notice that we can divide the respiratory tract into the upper and lower respiratory. So starting with the upper respiratory tract, you have the nose, the nasal cavity, and then the structure called the pharynx. The pharynx is at the back of the throat. It is combined with both the respiratory and the digestive system. So you're going to have a nasopharynx up there close to the nasal cavity, moving into the oropharynx. Because the pharynx is combined with the digestive tract, we will see a different type of epithelial tissue lining it. So we have stratified squamous epithelium for protection from the abrasion of food and drink that we don't need in the rest of the respiratory tract. The nose and the nasal cavity are both lined with the pseudostratified ciliated columnar, and we'll see that's part of the respiratory defense mechanism. The job of the nose and nasal cavity is really to warm that air, humidify that air before actually bringing it down lower into the body. And then also those nose hairs are important in helping to filter the air so it can trap large particles, debris, pathogens, and that sort of thing. When we are looking at the nasal cavity, remember you have those nasal conchae, those ridges in the bone that are creating turbulence so that the air is moving around, bumping around in the nasal cavity. So that's helping to warm it and humidify it. From the pharynx, we're going to see air moving into our lower respiratory tract. So the pharynx leads directly to the larynx, which is the top of the trachea. The larynx is also referred to commonly as the voice box. So you'll be looking at the cartilage anatomy of the structure as part of your lab study. From the larynx, air moves through the trachea, which people talk about as the windpipe, and then it divides into the left and right bronchi, which are the tubes carrying the air into the lung. The left and right bronchi divide into lobular or lobar bronchi. This is moving into the different lobes of the lungs. From there, you have what's described as segmental bronchi, bronchioles leading into the alveoli. In the past, those left and right bronchi have been referred to as primary bronchi, lobar as secondary bronchi, and segmental as tertiary bronchi. So you might still see those names if you're looking at some other resources. Collectively, the bronchioles and the alveoli are making up what's called the bronchopulmonary segment. So again, we're seeing that the left and right bronchi are dividing, or the trachea divides into the left and right bronchi before we get to the lung and then moving into the lung there. The bronchioles are significant because this is the structure that is aligned with the smooth muscle. So the bronchioles are the tubes in the lungs that can change diameter. So that smooth muscle will constrict in order to reduce airflow or dilate in order to increase airflow. The rest of these tubes are held open by cartilages. So the larynx, trachea, left and right bronchi, lobar, and segmental bronchi all have cartilage plates on the outside that are holding those tubes open. It's the bronchioles that are changing diameter based on that smooth muscle contraction. The alveoli are important because this is the location of gas exchange. So this is actually where the oxygen gas will make its way into the capillary and the carbon dioxide gas will make its way out of the blood into the alveoli so we can exhale it. We see that the majority of the respiratory tract is lined with that pseudostratified ciliated columnar. And then as we get into the bronchioles, we start to see simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. And then of course the alveoli, the site of gas exchange, you have simple squamous epithelium, which is important because it's easy then for those gases to move across. You can kind of describe the trachea and bronchi as a tree, so that's not uncommon. So in that case, your trachea is like the big trunk of the tree, and then branching into the right and left lung, you have the right bronchus and left bronchus, and then smaller branches, you have the lobular bronchi, which is taking it into either the 3 lobes of the right lung or the 2 lobes of the left. And then from there you have smaller branches called those segmental bronchi, all of which are taking you to those bronchioles. All of this in a highlight is our conducting portion, or we can talk about it as our anatomical dead space, because there's no gas exchange happening at any of these levels. This is just the pathway to get that air to the alveoli. It's not until we really get to those alveoli that we have gas exchange. Lining that conducting portion, for the most part, you have the respiratory mucosa, which is composed of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. Now this tissue is secreting mucus, which is going to be important in trapping pathogens and debris that's made its way down into the upper or lower respiratory tract. And then the cilia will actually beat that mucus and the trapped material into the pharynx. So if we're coming from the nasal cavity, we're moving down to the pharynx and then the esophagus. Or if we're in the bronchi, we're moving up the bronchi, up the trachea to the pharynx, and then swallowing down into the esophagus. Ultimately, this mucus should make its way into the stomach, where we have both hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes that are going to be important in breaking down any pathogens. So this is, of course, one of our non-specific defenses. This is an example of a physical barrier. This whole structure, I super love this name, can be called the mucociliary escalator, or my favorite is a mucus escalator. So you might see either one of these names used to describe this defense mechanism. Looking back at our listing of structures, we had our conducting portion, which is highlighted in yellow, and then we have the respiratory portion highlighted in that blue color. Some of those bronchioles are going to allow for some gas exchange as they get smaller and smaller and closer to the alveoli. So we will see them called respiratory bronchioles, and then alveoli also as part of the respiratory portion, meaning that this is where the gas exchange is actually happening. So of course the conducting portion is just conducting the air to the respiratory portion, and so that's why it's called the anatomical dead space. Let's take a closer look at our respiratory bronchiole and our alveoli. Those alveoli, those little air sacs, are opening up into like a bigger sac. That whole structure there with those respiratory bronchioles and those sacs of alveoli is referred to as a pulmonary lobule. This is, of course, our respiratory portion. Now, those alveoli are lined with simple squamous epithelium. Those cells are specifically named pneumatocyte type 1 cells. So pneumato is referring to the lungs, and then cyte is of course cell, so this is the lung cell type 1. These are the cells that are directly involved in gas exchange. So we will see them sharing a basement membrane with the capillary cells so that we have this respiratory membrane or blood-air barrier that's just 3 layers thick. So you have your alveolar cell, you have a fused basement membrane, and you have your capillary endothelial cell. And so those gases are just able to move through the phospholipid bilayer of these cell membranes from one cell to the next. So that is the job of our pneumatocyte type 1. We also have in our pulmonary lobules a second type of cell called the macrophage. So of course we've seen this one before, and we know that it's a phagocytic cell. It's one of our non-specific defenses. So its job is, of course, any pathogens that have made their way here can be phagocytized by these macrophages. And then we have a third important type of cell. This cell is called the pneumatocyte type 2. It's releasing an oily secretion called surfactant. That surfactant is lining those alveoli, and that is going to prevent collapse. So the way that those alveoli stay kind of like open balloons is because of the surfactant. If you don't have the surfactant, then they're going to collapse and stick to each other, and so you're not going to have good gas exchange at that point. So our 3 important types of cells are our pneumatocyte type 1, which is involved in gas exchange. Our phagocyte, which is our defense cell, it's doing phagocytosis of pathogens. And then our pneumatocyte type 2, which is responsible for making and secreting surfactant to prevent alveolar collapse. Okay, and that's it for now.